In April 1980, a tragedy unfolded in my country, the small West African nation of Liberia. People had come to celebrate a military coup against their government and the cold-blooded murder of their president. They watched as 13 former cabinet members were stripped, tied to poles, and executed. It was hard to believe in that moment that Liberia was Africa's oldest republic, founded 133 years before on the promise of peace and freedom for the American blacks who settled here during the time of slavery. But now the peace had ended, and there was worse, much worse to come. Liberia's story began in 1820, when 86 black passengers set sail on the Elizabeth from the United States for the west coast of Africa. It was 200 years after the first Africans were bound and shackled, transported against their wills to the New World. Now their descendants were heading back to Africa, back to the land of their ancestors. The voyage began with a reading from Deuteronomy chapter 11, the passage in which the Israelites were promised a land of milk and honey if they obeyed the Lord's commandments. They carried everything they owned. There was no turning back. The passengers had waved goodbye to their families and friends, many of whom they knew they would never see again. The genesis of the voyage was a slave revolt on the island of Santo Domingo, today's Haiti, and the violence it unleashed only miles away from America's shores. It was there, in 1791, that Toussaint Louverture led an uprising of black slaves. Hundreds of slave owners were killed and their plantations set ablaze. After years of oppression and exploitation, the slaves turned on the white plantation owners.
Africans basically said, enough is enough. We must be free. The only way to make it happen is by armed rebellion against our oppressors, against our enslavers. They're not successful in Brazil, but they are successful in Haiti. The word of that spreads like wildfire amongst the enslaved Africans. They don't have a newspaper, but they hear freedom is on the way.
Waves of white refugees from Haiti poured into U.S. ports, and the tales they told filled Southern whites with absolute terror. On December 21, 1816, a remarkable gathering of men met in Washington, D.C. There were Quakers who detested slavery, and slaveholders who detested free blacks. Together they formed the American Colonization Society. Its purpose, to send free blacks to Africa to reduce the possibility of slave revolt in the U.S., and also to extend what they called the civilizing influence of Christianity to the black continent. Members of the organization included Busford Washington, nephew of George Washington, Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, and James Monroe, future President of the United States. Most free blacks were deeply suspicious of the group's motives, yet some joined the enterprise despite their misgivings. Others felt that once in Africa they could finally determine their own future.
Because here, folks made the conscious choice of leaving the United States and returning to Africa, under the notion, many saying, I could never be free in the United States. How could these people who enslaved me for these many years accept my humanity? They will always question whether I am a human. Right? This was a common sentiment amongst many of those who returned to Africa.
5 weeks out of New York Harbor, after a calm voyage, the Elizabeth came within sight of Africa's west coast, at Sierra Leone. Here, on a small island, they waited for land. They couldn't depict a worse time or place. It was the rainy season, in a disease-ridden marshland with little fresh water. A death trap.
You read the letters they wrote back. This turns out to be a 2-year wait. And everybody's getting sick. They're getting malaria because they're not immune to malaria. The mosquito bit them, they got sick, and they died. And they died in large numbers. It was a total catastrophe.
With land assigned to them, the survivors sailed down the coast to settle what would become Liberia. Over the next 40 years, thousands of blacks from America, the West Indies, and other parts of Africa joined them. They took with them the American experience of slavery. They would come to dominate, exploit, and neglect the indigenous people they met on the coast. But they also married them and assimilated with them. A century and a half later, there remains a schism between the descendants of the newcomers and the indigenous people. Most of the early black settlers built their homes here, along the St. Paul River. They brought with them some of the place names they'd left behind. New Georgia, White Plains, Maryland in Africa, Mississippi in Africa, Virginia. They transplanted the architecture of southern plantations where most American blacks still lived as slaves. My great-grandfather, who came from North Carolina, lived in a house very much like this one. Many of the first black settlers were literate, and quite a few had owned businesses in the United States. Yet for almost a quarter of a century, white governors of the Colonization Society oversaw the new settlements. They even sent back reports on how the settlers dressed, kept their homes, and set their tables.
They dining room had a cover there for glasses, had a sitting table here for cooler. Here, the dishes cover. Here, the airbags. Here, the table from one anchor to another. With at least 6 chairs and 6 chairs here. So you can see how it was designed up. But all is breaking down.
The settlers had to share the land with indigenous tribes whose customs were far from theirs. This is Dimeh, a traditional village in the interior, home to the Gola, my mother's people. The Gola, along with the Kisi, are some of the oldest inhabitants of the region. More than a dozen other tribes migrated later. The Pele, Vai, Mende, Day, Kru, Iyo, Mano, Kra, Bele, Loma, Grebo, Bassa, Mandingo, and Bandi, each distinct from the others. The settlers would enter the ethnic mix. Long before the settlers arrived, though, the Zos, our ceremonial spirits, celebrated death, welcomed the harvest and initiated the young into adulthood. Today I dance with them, but as a child I feared them and the great powers I believed they had. The land was bountiful. The tribes traded with Europe since the 16th century, offering traditional hand-loomed cloth. Prized red pepper, called grains of paradise, led Europeans to name this the Grain Coast. And there were cowrie shells and soap for sale too. But no trade was as profitable as the slave trade. All the coastal tribes were involved, some more powerful than others, like the Bassa.
They were warring people. They had a very strong ancient army. And so they could sweep up anybody they met on the road. They had occupied the entire seacoast. They had two major trades, salt and slavery.
The countryside may look idyllic, but it has known terrible violence. Here, indigenous tribes raided each other for slaves. They also fought the settlers, who were trying to put an end to slavery, while attempting to expand and subdue the natives. A few tribes allied themselves with the newcomers, allowing them to dominate the coast with help from the U.S. Navy. In the area they controlled, the Colonization Society and the settlers were determined to create a sort of black America overseas.
Many began to look at Africa and to look at it with missionary eyes. I can go and help civilize Africa. They're not going to take up speaking the African languages, although they might ultimately. But that is not their mission. Their mission is to teach English. Their mission is to form schools. Their mission is to convert the heathens so that they can be nice and civilized and practice Christianity. That implies a certain attitude towards the place and the people that you're colonizing, and they came with that attitude, and as a result they rendered the indigenous inhabitants of that area as second-class entities.
The settlers came. They came with bright light. They came to educate the people, build new cities, as we can see today. But the fact was, the people wanted them to accept their culture, which they didn't agree to. This is what brought the conflict.
Wherever the settlers settled, they married indigenous women, but the offsprings become completely settler with settler mentality, settler culture, settler values. Because once you look back again into one of the reasons why this country was founded. This country was founded to serve as a beachhead for the dissemination of civilization and Christianity in Africa.
All hail Liberia, hail, all hail.
In 1847, 26 years after the settlers arrived from America, they declared themselves an independent republic to be called Liberia.